Chapter 2. After reaching an agreement whereby Damianos was to return to the cruiser and ask Malou, Dan's wife, about Daniel's past, and whereby Dan and Gustavo were going to retrace Dan's steps from the time he left college, the three men parted ways. When Dan and Gustavo returned to Solangi's house after Damianos had shown them a clear way through the forest, Chippewa was waiting for them, with dinner all laid out on the dining room table. At first Dan didn't want to sit down, but feeling hungry after all, he took a seat beside Gustavo. "Thanks for preparing the meal, Chippewa," Gustavo said, scooping some stew out of the pot in front of them. "Yes, thanks for that," Dan rejoined almost reluctantly, "but I don't think I can eat much under the circumstances. I wonder where Daniel is right now, and if he's got some food to eat tonight." A good question. Daniel had been waiting all day for the cruiser to come back, but it hadn't shown up. He was at a loss to know what he could do when at sunset, Mr. Oswaldo Gomez, the man who had fished him out of the water earlier that day, tapped him on the shoulder and squatted down beside him at the edge of the pier. "No sign of your family yet, I gather," he said. Daniel shook his head. "Well, we can't leave you out here by yourself, so why don't you come back with me? I'm sure we can find something in the fridge that will fill that hungry tummy of yours, okay?" "I don't want to impose, Mr. Gomez. Besides, my family might come back tonight." "Don't worry about that. I'll leave word with the marina manager to contact me if your cruiser comes back. He'll phone me if Destiny shows up during the night." Daniel got to his feet and stretched. His shoulder was still sore. He looked at it and frowned. "Do you think I could change that bandage when we get back to your place?" he asked. "Of course. My wife is a nurse and I'm sure she's got some bandages somewhere in the house. We'll get you all fixed up, no worries," Mr. Gomez told Daniel as he, too, stood up and patted the young man on the back. Mike, Mr. Gomez's son and the boy that Daniel had prevented from drowning that morning, was waiting for them when his father and Daniel reached the pickup truck. "Hey Daniel," Mike said, shifting to the middle of the bench seat so that Daniel could sit beside him. "How you doing? Your family hasn't come back, I guess?" "No, they haven't, and I'm worried. I really don't know where they could have gone all day. I wasn't gone that long with you guys. I really don't know what's happened to them." "We'll soon find out," Mr. Gomez said, as he climbed into the pickup and sat down at the wheel. 20 minutes later, the three of them arrived at the Gomez's house. Daniel was feeling awkward about the whole situation, but was happy enough that Mr. Gomez had come back to the pier to find him. Mrs. Gomez was in the kitchen, preparing dinner when they came in. She was a portly woman with an obviously happy disposition, her black hair tied at the nape of her neck, beautiful onyx eyes, and a smile that would welcome the devil himself. She trotted out to meet her family. "Hey you," she said to her son, "don't you dare drag your dirty shoes across the living room. You take those off before you go anywhere, you hear?" Then lifting her eyes to Daniel, she added, "And who might you be? Are you a friend of Mike?" "Yes, ma'am," Daniel replied, looking down at his bare feet. "The name is Daniel Politano, and I'm sorry to intrude." "Don't say another word, Daniel Politano, before you explain to me why you've got no clothes on and no shoes on your feet." Mrs. Gomez looked at Daniel up and down. Mr. Gomez shook his head. "Don't worry about that, Leah." He put an arm around his wife's shoulders. "Daniel here saved Mike from drowning." "Oh, God!" Leah interrupted, putting her hand to her mouth. "What did you do?" She stared at her son. "Nothing, Mum," Mike said. "I didn't see Daniel. He was swimming where I was water skiing, and neither Dad nor I saw him until I was head down in the water." "And that's why you got that gash on your arm, is it?" Leah asked Daniel. "Yes, ma'am, but it's okay now." "Not because you say so, young man." She turned her gaze up to her husband. "Okay, why don't we all get out of this hallway? Dinner is almost ready. And Mike, why don't you go upstairs and give some clothes to your friend, okay?" As the two men were upstairs, Leah and Oswaldo went to the kitchen. Leah checked the pasta sauce in the pot on the stove. She stirred it and then asked, "So what's the story, Oswaldo? Why isn't he wearing any clothes?" Oswaldo took a seat at the table and looked up at his wife. "I don't know if I can believe his story, but he had apparently gone for a swim this morning. And that's when we fished him out. That's when we got back to the marina. His family's cruiser had gone." "You mean they just left him there?" Leah looked appalled. "Did he look for them? What about the cruiser? Did you ask the manager?" Oswaldo nodded. "I sure did, and he said that Destiny, that's their boat, had been registered at the marina but had left later this morning. That's before we came back." "And you mean to tell me that Daniel has been waiting for them all day?" Leah stirred the sauce again. "How could his mum and dad do that? Can you imagine us leaving Mike behind anywhere?" "No, I can't imagine that either, honey, and that's why I think there's something wrong with this whole thing. Either they went searching for Daniel and got into an accident, or I don't really know what to think." "Well, let's have dinner and talk about it after everybody has eaten," Leah suggested. When Damianos returned to the cruiser where Malou, Stefano and Gabby were waiting for him, he sat down at the kitchen table below deck before he opened his mouth. He truly didn't know how he was going to alleviate the anxiety that cloaked the atmosphere such as a blanket of worrisome thoughts. "You saw Dad, didn't you?" Gabby inquired somewhat aggressively. Yes, I did, and the three of you should prepare yourselves for your journey into the future. How can we do that? Malou demanded. How could you ask us to follow Dan without Daniel? I didn't say that, my dear. Yes, you did, Gabby flared. I don't go without my brother, she added, petulantly. Just hear me out, please, Damien said, looking at the three anxious faces in turn. Your dad and I have agreed that he will start reliving his future while we try locating Daniel. And how are we supposed to do that? Stefano asked, opening his mouth for the first time since Damianos had come back. We're here at the pier, where we saw him last. We know he's taken a swim and gone out of our time and place, which to me means that he's somewhere in the past, doesn't it? Yes, Stefano, very good deduction. In fact, he couldn't have gone farther than his 20 years of age. Why is that? Malou asked. That's because he wasn't alive before his birth, and unless I accompanied him to a past beyond his years, he couldn't have relived a past he hadn't lived beforehand. Okay, but say he's returned to a time like a few days from now, Gabby suggested. Wouldn't he have found us by then? Yes, he would. He would have been here for days now, and he should have found us upon his return, except... Except what? Malou asked. Except that he couldn't have returned to a time when we were together with him. He couldn't have been in two places at once. Could you explain what that means? Stefano didn't understand. Well, let's imagine that he came back from this morning's swim while we were fishing. Remember that day? Stefano looked at the three, still worried faces. They nodded. Okay, so he couldn't have come back to a place where he already was at that time. You mean he's gone to a time after his birth and before he was searching for Dad with us, right? Yes, Gabby, that's right, and I'll be a little more precise than that, actually. You see, when we all went to the bike race, he was with your dad at a time you three raced together, so the question is, how old was he when he raced with your dad and you, Stefano? Oh, wow, that's difficult to say, Damien. You see, we've raced so many times together, it's hard to say which race it was, Stefano replied. Okay, let me ask this then. When did you and Daniel go to Big Cyprus for the first time? To race with Daniel, you mean? Yes, Stefano. Do you recall when that was? Oh, Daniel must have been 15 or something. I don't remember exactly, sorry. I think you're right, Stefano, Malou put in. I didn't want to let him race in a real competition before then. He was too young, but I believe we went to Big Cyprus with Daniel when he was around 15 years old, yes. Okay then, let's assume you're right, Malou. Then the next question we have to ask is, when did he start swimming on his own? Oh, that's a bit easier, Malou replied. When we moved from Pennsylvania to Florida, he was about 10 years old, and that's when he began swimming in the ocean. Yet he was never going out alone, and always stayed close to the beach until he was older. Say he was maybe 12 when I would let him swim on his own. Very good, Damien said, cracking a tentative smile. You see, we have now a window of 3 years in which Daniel could have gone. Before that, he would have not ventured out beyond the beach, or the marina in this instance, and after that, he wouldn't have participated in a race before the age of 15. But we still have a problem, Malou suggested, insofar as Daniel has never gone to Key West alone or with us. Not that I recall anyway. And no one would have recognised him at the marina anyway, Gabby said, crossing her arms over her chest. You mean that if you had been living in Key West all along, perhaps he would have recognised the local family or friend from his youth and gone with him? Damien asked. Yeah, Gabby replied. See, where we live in Davy, we've got loads of friends, and we often go to the beach or even the marina. We hung out together, and if he had gone swimming anywhere round there, I'm sure he would have met some neighbour or some of his friends from school even. Again, very good suggestion, Gabby, thank you. Damien tried throwing her a quick smile, but she didn't return it. Instead, she lowered her gaze. Gabby was still angry. All the smiles in the world wouldn't have had any effect on her at this point. Okay, where do we start? Malou asked. Are we going to Big Cyprus and work our way backwards? I think we need to think of the best and fastest way to tackle the task. And for tonight, I believe it's best that we have some food and then retire to our beds. But didn't you once say that there's no time like the present? Gabby argued. Yes, I probably said that, Gabby. However, starting a search at night and on an empty stomach is never a good idea. Here, here, Stefano said, getting up. Why don't I get some pizza out the freezer, Mum? Get them warmed up in the oven? I suppose so, Malou replied without her usual enthusiasm. I'm not really hungry, but if you guys are, why don't you go ahead and do that?